One of my favorite things about my job at CSIRO is getting into the labs and talking to our researchers and getting to see all of the really interesting stuff that we're doing, groundbreaking science in a lot of cases. And when you think about it, that's really the genesis of innovation in a lot of cases. And what I wanted to do today is share with you a couple of stories, a couple of the things I've seen recently around CSIRO, a couple of the labs I've been in, pull that back and then look at what is that. Let's talk more generally about innovation, talk about disruptive technology and talk about what that means. And then finally, talk about how we approach that at CSIRO and how we're working with some of our customers and our partners to help them understand what the long-term impact of some of that science and technology will be. The first example I wanted to touch on, I was just down in Melbourne recently. Some of you may be familiar with our Lab 22 down there, which is it's our 3D printing lab. And Alex Kingsbury, who runs that lab, and her team down there are absolutely fantastic, and they're doing some really, really interesting things. One of the most interesting to me is we had a case last year where a patient had presented themselves. They had chest wall sarcoma that needed to be operated on. They needed to remove the tumor. And I'm not a surgeon, but from what I'm told, that's a very complicated surgery that involves removing part of the sternum and rib cage. And that historically, the way we used to deal with that is that the implants would be, we'd put a titanium plate in place of the sternum, but it often had significant problems with fit and getting it to stay in place. So we worked with a company down in Melbourne, a small company called Anatomics, and what we did is we took a high-res CT scan, CAT scan from the patient, built a 3D model of their rib cage and sternum out of that, and built a custom-made implant that was then put into the patient using our titanium 3D printers in our lab down in Melbourne. It was the operation was a success, and from all accounts that I've heard, the patient has recovered very well. This is exactly the kind of example in my mind where, in this case, innovation is literally life-saving. But where we're taking technology that was once just in the lab, and we're now starting to see that come out and have real impact in the world and frankly in patient outcomes as well. We've got a picture of it here. You can see what that implant looks like inside the patient's rib cage. Obviously a 3D model there, not the actual thing. The second example I wanted to touch on, I think we hear a lot about data and digital reshaping industries, and certainly healthcare is one of those industries that are going to be disrupted by data and digital. So a couple of years ago, we had a group that was working, so it was a joint group led by CSIRO and Queensland Health, looking at cardiac rehab. So heart disease, obviously the number one killer here in Australia and I think in most wealthy countries. What doctors have found, obviously, is that rehabilitation after a first heart attack leads to a decreased risk of future heart attacks. But that used to involve, you'd have to go into the hospital, you'd go through a 6-week program, 18 sessions, and unfortunately, even though it has very positive results, what we were seeing is that patients weren't following through with it. So they weren't getting in the program in the first place, and they weren't completing it. This team, what they did is they developed the world's first smartphone-based cardiac rehab program. So now you don't have to go into the hospital. You run this program from home. And so we ran clinical trials, or we ran tests on this to see how patients used it. And what we found is that it improved the likelihood that a patient was going to start the program by 30%, and it made it 70% more likely that they were going to complete the program. So obviously very, very positive results there. We have, that team has recently spun out of CSIRO and created a company to commercialize that product called CardiHab. They ran through CSIRO's own internal accelerator program called ON, the first instance of that last year, and they were just accepted into the HCF Catalyst Program, I think one of 9 teams out of 200 some odd applicants. So there's a couple of real-world examples of how we're seeing technology, again, moving from the lab and getting out into real outcomes. And so when we're out talking with our partners, with our customers, in a wide number of segments, questions that we're asking them, and I think 3 key questions that businesses need to be asking themselves. What role is innovation going to play, and how is it going to help you create your next billion-dollar business? If you're Telstra, if you're BHP Billiton, what role is that going to play? Second, what disruptive technology is going to put you out of business in the next 10 years? And this question scares the heck out of boardrooms. At that level, they're very scared by this. Innovation, interestingly, and disruption. And then third, and most importantly, what should you be doing about that today in your business? Not tomorrow, but today. I want to talk just a little bit about how we think about those questions at CSIRO, and again, how we're working with some of our partners to help answer those. I lead up a group called CSIRO Futures, and we've been looking at global megatrends for the last 7 years. These are those big shifts, environmental, economic, technological, and social trends that are going to have a significant impact on the world and the way that we live. But when we're out presenting this, when we're out talking to people, and I'm not going to go through them in detail today, but the question that we get most often is, okay, great, that's interesting, but what does that mean to me? What does that mean for my business? How is that going to impact me? We've been doing a lot of thinking about that, and just yesterday released a report that we call Australia 2030. In this report, it's intended to provide a framework for Australia and for Australian businesses to think more intelligently about how long-term change will impact their business and the role that science, technology, and innovation can and should play in helping them answer those 3 big questions that I just mentioned. So it's really about how do you get from megatrends to innovation, or about how do you get from science to strategy, if you look at it from the other way around. So this report we've developed over the last year. It was part of our own internal strategy that we went through last year, our most recent strategy. And we crowdsourced input for this report across all 5,000 of our staff at CSIRO, and developed, from the megatrends, we developed 4 scenarios for what Australia could look like in 2030. We took each of those scenarios and looked at what opportunities and what challenges, what risks is that going to create across a number of our key sectors here in Australia. And then finally, we developed a high-level framework for individual businesses to use to think about how to incorporate that type of thinking into their own strategy. And that, in fact, that's what we do ourselves inside CSIRO. So I'll share with you very quickly what those scenarios are. But before I do that, why take this kind of approach? Why use scenarios? What's the purpose of that? And really, it comes down to kind of 3 things. The first is it's a great way to expand our thinking, and particularly to make sure that we're not falling into the trap of groupthink, which I think we're all susceptible to at times. The second is to understand what are the trade-offs between the decisions that we make today and the impact those are going to have in the long run. And finally, it's a great tool to guide strategic planning in uncertain conditions, which we're facing today. The first scenario we call digital DNA, and this is about Australia experiencing a dramatic shift towards a digital services-based economy. It's about every industry changing and being changed by data and by digital. And that's enabled by exponential growth in computing power, by an increasingly connected world, and by the new technologies and business models that I've been discussing. Obviously a very positive scenario for us here in Australia, and I think where a lot of sort of our collective mindset thinks that we should be going. The second scenario we call mining and dining. And this is a reemergence of our core resources-based industries. So driven by increasing globalization, particularly as India comes up the curve, just as China has over the last 20 years, seeing a strong reemergence for demand for our resources. And that's not just minerals, but also energy, food, and water. also a fairly strong scenario for us here in Australia. The third scenario that we look at, we call clean and lean. And this is really about being able to decouple strong economic performance and environmental sustainability. And in fact, there's a body of work that we've done at CSIRO that suggests that we can do exactly that. So we can essentially have our cake and eat it as well. And to do that, it's going to require strong investments in technology and innovation to improve our resource efficiency. This scenario will also likely involve shifts in consumer behavior and our own preferences and how we think about the products that we use. And finally, the fourth scenario that we looked at, we call weathering the storm. This is the one of the four that's a negative scenario. And in this, we'd see geopolitical instability, potentially created by climate change, which could create shortages of food, water, could create conflict over access to land, has the potential to destabilize some of our trade relationships, and to disrupt global supply chains. Obviously very negative. And in developing these, we intentionally went to the extremes, and there's a narrative and there's evidence behind each of these. By looking at the extremes, we can help think about what are the things that we'll need under each of those divergent and extreme scenarios. The other thing I'll say is that each of these is really about how the megatrends play out in different combinations, different ways. It's also important, though, that that doesn't just become a thought exercise, and this was essential to us, and this is something that we started from, was to say, okay, well, we're not just going to come up with scenarios and here they are, but how do you use them? And again, this is something that we're using ourselves. We developed a four-step methodology that can be applied to strategic thinking, and to take that kind of scenario and megatrends approach and turn it into action, turn it into innovation. So the first is to explore the future landscape through trends and scenario development to identify those opportunities. The second is, based on that, to choose your future strategy. And this is really about business strategy based on technology opportunities. The third is to plan future investments and to create a portfolio of science and technology of investments. And that's really about how do you translate those business objectives into science and technology. And then finally, create future change. A couple of things here that we're working on. I mentioned the spin-out company earlier, went through our inaugural ON program. So ON is a program that we've created inside CSIRO that we're going to be expanding outside CSIRO. It's an accelerator. And it's really about how do we get deep science and technology out of CSIRO, out of the universities, and commercialize it out into the marketplace. And when we say deep science, that's often the kinds of things where either the time frames or the level of risk is too high for traditional investors to come in and want to invest in that. Where venture capitalists are typically looking for a return in kind of the 5-year horizon. I'll leave it with a few final thoughts here. And the first is that all of this requires thinking into the future. It requires long-term thinking, long-term planning. But prediction is actually very difficult, and this is a quote from Niels Bohr, the famous physicist, especially about the future. And that's the challenge that we've got here, that we are in fact facing a very uncertain future, that it's not clear where things are going to be in 15 years or 20 years. However, I think it's clear that regardless of which scenario we end up in, regardless of the direction we go, science, technology, and innovation are going to be critical to maintaining our competitiveness here in Australia and critical to addressing those major challenges. And finally, that the decisions that we make today about those investments, whether it's at the boardroom, whether it's lower down than that, or whether it's the decisions that we make collectively as a society, are going to shape the future that we end up in. So in many ways, when we look at those scenarios, it's not so much about how we react to those scenarios. It's about what are the things that we start doing today to push ourselves into the more positive scenarios and to mitigate the risks associated with the more negative ones.